Good evening to all the beautiful people tuning in. I'm here to help you sleep. Please support me by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. I'm also curious to know where you're watching from and at what time, so drop a comment below. Are you ready? Let's start with the first story.
The title of the story: The Ghost of the Old Camper. The evening air in the dense forest was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the campsite. A group of 4 friends, Jason, Sarah, Mark, and Emily, had set up their tents in a secluded area, miles away from the nearest road. They had heard about the place from a local guide who spoke of its past as a once popular camping destination. But now it was mostly forgotten, its charm overshadowed by the stories that lingered, whispering of strange occurrences that had driven many away. Jason, the self-proclaimed leader of the group, was the first to speak. "This place is perfect," he said, a grin stretched across his face. "We'll have the whole forest to ourselves." But Sarah, who had always been the more cautious one, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As they unpacked their gear, she noticed remnants of old, decaying tents and scattered food tins long abandoned by previous campers. The old campfire pit sat cold and uninviting, as if it had been forgotten for years. But Jason waved off her concerns, convincing the group that the neglect was simply a result of time. As night fell, the group gathered around the fire, the crackling flames casting eerie shadows on the trees. The forest was unnervingly quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. They laughed and joked, but Sarah could feel the hairs on the back of her neck prickle. The air had grown thick, and she couldn't shake the oppressive sense that they weren't alone. Mark, ever the skeptic, had begun to tell a story, something lighthearted, about a prank he once played on his younger brother. But halfway through, the laughter died in his throat as a soft, unmistakable whisper carried on the wind. It was too faint to understand, but it was there, definite and chilling. "What was that?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. The others looked around, their faces drawn with concern. "Probably just the wind," Jason said, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence. But as the night deepened, the atmosphere grew heavier. Tent doors creaked open and closed of their own accord, the sound echoing through the trees. The fire flickered as if disturbed by some unseen force, casting erratic shadows that seemed to dance just beyond the circle of light. Then came the footsteps, soft but deliberate. It was as though someone was walking just beyond the edge of their campsite, but whenever they looked, no one was there. Emily, visibly shaken, clutched Jason's arm. "We should leave," she murmured, her voice trembling. "I don't like this. I don't feel safe." Jason was about to respond when a loud rustling came from the direction of the woods. It was a sound like something or someone moving quickly through the brush. Mark jumped to his feet, his flashlight scanning the trees. "Anyone else hear that?" he asked, his voice now tight with apprehension. The rustling continued, closer now, and it wasn't the wind. It was something alive, something moving in the dark. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. She could feel it. Something was watching them, something malevolent. Her eyes darted around, searching for any sign of life, but there was only the inky blackness beyond the reach of the fire. "I'm going to check it out," Jason said, grabbing his flashlight and moving toward the edge of the camp. The others tried to protest, but he was already walking into the dark.
Mark was about to follow when a sound made him stop. A whisper, so soft and faint it was almost inaudible, drifted into his ears. "Help me, help me." It was unmistakably a voice, and it sounded like it was coming from behind him. Turning quickly, he saw nothing but the darkness. His heart raced, and he could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The whisper came again, but this time it was closer. "Help, help me." Mark froze, his flashlight shaking in his hand. The others, still sitting by the fire, hadn't heard it, but he had. He could feel it. Whatever was out there, it wasn't human, and it wanted them to know. Jason, come back. We need to leave now." But it was too late. The next moment, a chilling scream echoed from the woods, followed by the unmistakable sound of running footsteps. Jason's flashlight flickered once, then vanished into the blackness. Emily's face turned pale. "We need to go now," she said, voice shaking with fear. But as they began packing their things in a frenzy, a single muddy footprint appeared in the dirt, leading out of the camp and deep into the forest. Jason was gone. Frantic, the group followed the footprints, their breath coming in ragged gasps as they ventured deeper into the woods. The trail led them to an abandoned clearing, overgrown with thick vines. The forest was unnaturally quiet now. The only sound, their own labored breathing. They searched desperately, calling out for Jason, but the only reply was the rustling of leaves in the wind. Then they found it. Lying in the center of the clearing, illuminated by the pale moonlight, was Jason's flashlight, still glowing faintly, its beam pointing toward an old tree. His backpack was tossed aside, and his jacket lay crumpled on the ground, but there was no sign of him. A chilling thought gripped Sarah's heart. "This wasn't just an accident," she said, her voice trembling. Something is here." As the group stood there, the whisper returned, louder now. "Help me! Help me!" The sound seemed to come from every direction, and it was then they saw it. A shadow, moving at the edge of the trees. The figure was indistinct, blurry, but it was there, and it was coming toward them. In a blind panic, they turned and ran, hearts pounding in their chests. They didn't stop until they were safely back at the campsite. But the terror didn't end there. When they returned home, The strange whispers followed them. Every night they would hear it, soft at first, then louder, always from the corners of the room. Help me, help me. And sometimes, when they were alone, they would find muddy footprints on the floor, leading nowhere. It wasn't just the spirit that haunted them. It was the memory of the forest itself, its dark secrets now entwined with their own. The past had never truly left the woods, and now it was following them, waiting.
The title of the story, The Cursed Trail. Jake had always been drawn to the wild, to the kind of solitude only nature could offer. It was the reason he chose to take his annual camping trip to a remote patch of the Appalachian Mountains, far from the hustle and bustle of city life. The forest here felt untouched, the air cleaner, and the silence almost too peaceful. He had heard rumors, sure, about strange disappearances, but Jake wasn't one to let folklore keep him from experiencing the beauty of the wilderness. He had been hiking for hours, reveling in the serenity of the forest, when he noticed the trail. It was narrow and winding, hidden between overgrown shrubs, and at first glance it seemed like nothing more than a forgotten path. Curious, Jake decided to follow it, eager to see where it might lead. At first, everything seemed normal. The air was fresh, the birds chirped above, and the ground beneath his boots was soft but firm. But as he moved deeper into the woods, a strange sensation crept up his spine. The deeper he ventured, the quieter the forest became. The usual sounds of birds and insects faded into an eerie stillness. Even the wind, which had been rustling through the trees before, seemed to hold its breath. The first sign that something wasn't right came when Jake noticed marks on the trees. They weren't the natural wear of branches scraping against bark, but deliberate, jagged scratches, too perfect to have been made by an animal. The markings seemed to form a pattern, as if someone, or something, had carefully carved them into the trunks. His fingers brushed over the markings, sending a chill down his spine, but he shook the thought away. Maybe it was just a prank, some hikers trying to mark the trail in their own strange way. But the air had begun to grow thicker, heavier, as if the very atmosphere of the forest was pressing in on him. The sky above was dimming, despite the early afternoon hour. The wind picked up, but its sound was different now. Instead of the gentle whispering of trees, it seemed almost like voices, faint, intelligible murmurs carried on the breeze. He couldn't make out the words, but the feeling of being watched crawled under his skin.
The ground beneath his feet felt soft, almost spongy, like it had been disturbed not long ago. He took another step forward, the crunch of twigs beneath his boots breaking the silence. His heart began to race, but Jake told himself it was nothing, just the normal paranoia that crept in when alone in the woods. But then came the second sign, the abandoned campsite. He stumbled upon it just as the sun began to dip lower into the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. There, hidden in a small clearing, was an old campsite. Tents lay torn and decaying, the fabric shredded by time and neglect. The fire pit was cold, the remnants of a long-dead fire still visible in the ashes. And scattered around the site were rocks, each one carved with strange symbols, runes that Jake didn't recognize and that certainly hadn't been made by any local culture he knew of. A shiver ran through him. The symbols looked ancient, primal. There was something deeply unsettling about the campsite, as though it had been abandoned in a hurry. He bent down to inspect the fire pit, but the scent in the air wasn't just the earthy smell of wet leaves. It was something old, something fetid, like decay. It felt wrong. A soft rustle in the trees made Jake stand up straight. He spun around, expecting to see another hiker, or perhaps a squirrel, but the clearing was empty. The wind had died down completely, and now only silence surrounded him. A nagging feeling began to creep into his mind. He had read about people getting lost in the Appalachian Mountains, heard stories from locals about strange, cursed places where the forest seemed to swallow people whole. But Jake wasn't the superstitious type. He wasn't going to let a few eerie markings or some ancient symbols send him running. But as the light began to fade, so did his confidence. The forest was no longer the serene place he had wandered into earlier. The once familiar sounds of nature were replaced by that odd whispering wind. And then it happened. The unmistakable creaking of footsteps.
At first, he thought it was just the wind again, but then the footsteps came closer. Jake's heart began to pound in his chest as he turned to face the source, but the clearing was empty. Nothing but the remnants of the abandoned campsite. But the sound continued, growing louder, closer, as if something, no, someone, was moving toward him, just out of his sight. Panic set in. He had to leave. This place wasn't right. But when he turned to retrace his steps, he found that the trail was no longer familiar. The trees had shifted. The path that had once seemed clear was now a maze of twisting branches and dense foliage. It was as though the forest itself had changed in the time he had spent at the campsite. The whispers grew louder, clearer, as though the wind was speaking directly to him now. But it was not the voice of the forest. No, this voice was different, almost human, but faint and desperate. Leave. Now. Before it's too late. Jake froze. His eyes darted around the forest, but there was no one in sight. His pulse quickened. He had to get out, but the more he tried to walk back, the more disoriented he became. The trees seemed to close in on him, their gnarled branches stretching toward him like skeletal fingers. He could hear the sound of something moving in the darkness, following him, stalking him. But whenever he turned, there was nothing. And then, through the darkness, a figure appeared. It was pale, almost translucent, drifting between the trees. Its shape was indistinct, barely more than a shadow. But the face, if you could call it that, was clear. It was a ghastly, hollow visage with hollow eyes that stared directly into Jake's soul. His heart stopped. The figure moved toward him, its slow, haunting steps echoing through the woods. Jake tried to run, but his legs felt like lead, the forest refusing to let him escape. The whispers were no longer in the wind. They were in his ears, in his mind. You can't leave. No one ever leaves the trail. The words reverberated in his skull as the figure reached out, a cold hand brushing his shoulder. He gasped, spinning around, but there was nothing. Only the darkness of the forest closing in around him. In that moment, Jake realized with a sickening twist that he hadn't been following a trail at all. The trail had been following him, leading him deeper into its cursed labyrinth. The spirits of the lost, those who had ventured into the woods before him, were not just whispers in the trees. They were part of the forest now, their presence woven into every leaf and stone. As the figure vanished into the shadows, Jake understood he wasn't meant to leave. The curse of the trail was a cycle, a never-ending loop of despair. The forest had claimed him, just as it had claimed all those before him. And as the night swallowed him whole, Jake's scream was lost in the wind, carried away into the depths of the cursed trail. The forest, it seemed, had already forgotten him. The title of the story: The Hidden Path of the Forest. The Appalachian Mountains loomed like ancient sentinels over the dense forest, their towering peaks casting long shadows across the land. A group of 6 friends, John, Sarah, Mark, Emily, Ben, and Hannah, had planned this weekend escape for months. They sought solace in the wilderness, far away from the noise of their daily lives. They had heard tales of the beauty of this secluded corner of the mountains, a place untouched by civilization. What they didn't know was that their journey would lead them into something far darker. They set up camp just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an eerie golden glow over the trees. The air was fresh, the scent of pine and earth heavy with the promise of adventure. They laughed, joked, and huddled around the crackling campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories under the vast starry sky. The night felt magical, serene, as if the forest had embraced them. But as the fire burned low, an unsettling stillness settled over the camp. The gentle rustling of leaves and the chirping of crickets grew distant, replaced by a quiet that pressed in on them from all sides. Ben was the first to notice it. He stood up abruptly, his eyes scanning the dark line of trees that marked the edge of their campsite. "I swear I heard something," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, squinting at him. "Footsteps," Ben said. "Soft ones, like someone walking in the woods, but there's no one out there." Emily shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders. "Stop scaring us, Ben. You're just imagining it." Ben, trying to shake off the unease, returned to the fire. But the feeling didn't leave. In fact, it grew. Every creak of a tree branch, every whisper of wind through the leaves seemed to carry a weight, as if something unseen was watching them. As the night deepened, strange occurrences began. Their equipment began to vanish. First, it was a flashlight, then a water bottle. It wasn't just misplaced, it was gone. Mark swore he had left the flashlight beside the fire, but when he went to grab it, it was nowhere to be found. "What the hell's going on?" Mark snapped, searching the area around the fire. "It's probably just the wind or an animal," John suggested, though he sounded uncertain. But the unease didn't stop. In the dead of night, the group heard whispers, low, intelligible murmurs that seemed to drift on the wind. At first, they thought it was their imagination, but the whispers grew louder, closer. They could hear it clearly now, a voice calling from the dark. "Did you hear that?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "Probably just the trees creaking," Sarah said, though her voice lacked conviction. But John, always the skeptic, decided to investigate. He grabbed a flashlight and moved toward the tree line, his beam slicing through the blackness. The others watched anxiously as John's figure disappeared into the forest. Minutes passed, then 10, then 20. The darkness seemed to stretch on forever. John never returned. Panic began to grip the group. Ben stood up, his face pale. He said, "We have to find him. Now." They grabbed their gear and ventured into the forest, calling out John's name, but the forest swallowed their voices. The deeper they went, the more the forest seemed to change. The air grew colder, thicker, and the trees pressed in on them as if they were being herded deeper into the unknown. The whispers continued, echoing in the silence. And then, as if in answer to their growing dread, they found it. Hidden among the dense undergrowth was a village, a place untouched by time. The wooden huts, weathered and worn, were built in a circle around an eerie clearing. The ground was covered in leaves and moss, and the air smelled faintly of decay. The village looked abandoned, yet something about it seemed wrong, as if it was waiting for them. They entered cautiously, but the feeling of being watched intensified. Their footsteps echoed against the silence, a hollow sound that seemed to reverberate through the village. In the center of the clearing, they discovered a shrine, a circle of stones marked with strange, intricate symbols. The air around it was thick with an unnatural energy, and the hairs on their arms stood on end. "This isn't just some forgotten village," Mark said, his voice low with realization. Then they found it, their worst fear confirmed. They discovered a burial site, bones scattered not just of animals but of humans. Their clothing, remnants of a lost time, remained entangled in the decaying remains.
Emily gasped, her hand trembling as she pointed to a wooden mask carved and painted with grotesque details. It seemed almost alive, its eyes staring back at her with an unsettling intensity. Who were these people? Sarah asked, her voice quivering. Before anyone could respond, a low growl echoed from the forest, deep and guttural. The ground beneath them seemed to tremble. Then from the trees came the shape, large, shadowy, and swift. It moved through the darkness like a specter, its eyes glowing faintly. "What the hell is that?" Ben screamed, backing away. "Unless the woods want you to leave, they won't."
The figure emerged fully into the clearing, its form more terrifying than they could have imagined. It was a creature, half man, half beast, cloaked in the shadows of the trees. Its eyes locked on the group, and the air grew thick with dread. "The creature that haunts the forest," Mark whispered, his face pale. It wasn't just a monster. It was a part of the tribe's ancient rituals. The people who had once lived here didn't leave. They were taken, kept alive by the creature, offering them up as sacrifices. The whispers they had heard, the vanishing equipment, and the sense of being watched were all part of the ritual, a signal that the creature was near. And now the tribe had claimed them. The creature lunged at them, but before it could reach them, something strange happened. The ground rumbled again, and the air grew heavy. The creature paused, then retreated into the forest. The group stood frozen, unable to move. "We need to leave," Sarah urged, her voice tight with fear. But as they turned to flee, they heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind them. Slow, deliberate steps, getting closer. They turned in unison, and there, in the shadows, stood John, his face gaunt, his eyes wide and empty. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice hollow. "We're not leaving. We belong here now." The twist of horror sunk in. They weren't the ones being hunted. They were the next offering. The tribe didn't take outsiders. They kept them, forever bound to the forest, lost in the endless cycle of sacrifice. And as the darkness closed in, they realized too late. Their fate had already been sealed. The title of the story, "The Death That Began from the Ancient Tree." The crackling sound of the campfire was the only thing that broke the heavy silence as John stirred the logs, the flames dancing in the chilly night air. His wife, Sarah, leaned back against a tree, eyes closed as she let the warmth of the fire envelop her. The children, Max and Lily, were huddled together in their tent, giggling softly. "Isn't this perfect?" Sarah murmured. "Just what we needed." John smiled and nodded, but inside something gnawed at him. It wasn't the first time they had camped in the wilderness, but this forest, there was something different about it. The trees seemed taller here, their trunks more twisted, their bark darker. And then there was the ancient tree, standing at the edge of their campsite, a towering presence that seemed to watch them. The locals had warned them about the tree when they passed through town. "Stay clear of it," the old man had said, his voice low and grave. He had spoken in riddles, his words leaving John unsettled. But now, as they sat by the fire, those words seemed to echo in his mind. He glanced over at the ancient tree. It was massive, its gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal arms, as though it were trying to draw them in. "Everything okay?" Sarah asked, noticing his distracted gaze. John nodded quickly, shaking off the unease. "Yeah, just admiring the view."
Later that night, as the family settled into their tents, John couldn't shake the feeling that the tree was watching them. Every creak of the branches seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. He tried to fall asleep, but the whispers started, low at first, then growing louder. He strained to listen, but the voice was indistinguishable, too soft to make out. A sudden sound of movement in the tent startled him. He sat up, heart racing, and saw Sarah sitting upright, eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Before John could answer, a sharp creaking sound came from outside, the unmistakable sound of a heavy door swinging open. It was followed by soft footsteps, too slow and deliberate to be the wind. John's stomach twisted with dread. He didn't move, too afraid that if he did, it would make everything worse. The footsteps grew louder. Then they stopped. Suddenly, the tent flap blew open with a loud snap. John rushed to close it, but as his hand brushed the fabric, he froze. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the ancient tree, its shadow cast long against the forest floor. And there in the distance he saw a figure standing by the trunk, motionless. "John," Sarah's voice trembled from behind him. "What is it?" He looked at her, eyes wide. "I don't know. I thought I saw something." But when he looked back toward the tree, it was gone. The figure was no longer there. The next morning, the forest was quiet. Too quiet. The eerie feeling didn't dissipate, it only seemed to intensify. John felt the pull of the tree even stronger now. He had to go to it, see it close up, feel its presence. His legs moved almost of their own accord,
and before he knew it, he was standing beneath its twisted branches, staring up at the thick bark, his breath shallow. A faint rustling sounded in the distance, and then a voice, soft and rasping, like the wind through the leaves. "Come closer." John's heart raced. He turned, his feet carrying him back to the campsite, but it felt like something was holding him back, forcing him to look. When he finally reached the others, he was out of breath, his skin clammy. "I need to go home," he said, but his voice was unsteady. Sarah looked at him, her brow furrowed. "I know, but there's something strange happening here. I can feel it too." Later that night, Max, the youngest, came to John, his face pale. "I saw a man in the tree," he said, voice trembling. "He was pulling something or someone into the ground." John's heart stopped. "What?" Lily, too, spoke up, her voice faint. "I had a nightmare. The man in my dream. He was trying to crawl out of the ground, but he was stuck." The children's words chilled John to the bone. He tried to dismiss it, but the pull of the tree was growing stronger, like it had a hold of his soul. In the dead of night, John couldn't resist any more. He walked back to the tree, his feet dragging. As he stood there, a cold wind rustled the leaves, and the whispers returned, louder than ever. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice said, now clear. John looked up, and his breath caught in his throat. There, in the bark of the tree, he saw an image, an outline of a man's face, distorted and writhing like a trapped soul. And then, in an instant, the face was gone, replaced by the words, "We are eternal." A sharp scream broke the silence. Sarah's voice. She had followed him. She stood just behind him, her eyes wide with terror. "John," she whispered, "we need to leave now." But it was too late. The ancient tree had claimed its next victims. As John turned, the ground beneath him gave way, and the tree's branches reached out, ensnaring him, pulling him down. The family vanished that night, their names fading into the forgotten history of the forest. But the tree remained, its twisted form ever more grotesque, its curse growing stronger. In the years that followed, a few brave souls came seeking the truth, but none ever returned, and the whispers continued, ever louder in the wind. "We are eternal." The title of the story, The Cursed Wolf and the Whispers of the Forest. The wind howled through the trees, sending eerie whispers across the forest floor. It was a night like no other, dark, oppressive, and heavy with an ancient feeling. The group of friends had just finished setting up their campfire, the flames flickering and dancing in the dark, casting long shadows across their faces. They had heard the stories, the ones about the cursed wolf,
a creature driven mad by a curse placed upon it centuries ago. The tale had been passed down from generation to generation, whispered around campfires and told in hushed tones. It was said that the wolf roamed these woods, its howl echoing through the trees on nights just like this one. It had become a myth, a warning from the past, but none of them believed it. They had come here for the adventure, to escape the mundane and immerse themselves in the thrill of the unknown. "Come on, it's just a story," Jake said, his voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire. But even as he spoke, a strange feeling lingered in the air, an unsettling energy that they couldn't quite explain. The forest seemed too quiet, unnaturally quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing but the occasional rustle of the leaves, the branches creaking in the wind. Then they heard it. A faint howl in the distance, barely audible, but unmistakable. It was a sound that seemed to vibrate through their bones, sending a shiver of fear down their spines. The air grew colder, the wind sharper, as if the forest itself had noticed their presence. They looked at each other, unease creeping into their hearts.
"I told you," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "We shouldn't be here." "Relax," Jake said, trying to sound confident. "It's just an animal." But even as he spoke, the howls grew louder. The sound was no longer distant but close, too close. They could hear the unmistakable rhythm of paws moving through the underbrush, the shifting of leaves under the weight of something large. It wasn't an animal. It was something far more dangerous. "I don't like this," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "Just go to sleep," Jake said, trying to mask his own anxiety. "We'll be fine." But sleep wouldn't come. The sounds continued, the howls, the soft growls, the creaking of the trees. It was as if the forest itself was alive, watching them. The wind picked up, and a strange scent filled the air, something earthy, foul, and wild. The fire crackled violently, and for a brief moment, the flames flickered out, plunging them into darkness. The silence was suffocating. "Did you hear that?" Mike's voice cracked. He stood up, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond their camp. The others followed his gaze, but there was nothing. Only the shifting shadows. Suddenly, Alex stood up and walked toward the edge of the clearing. "I'm going to check it out," he said, his voice steady, but his hands trembling slightly. "Alex, don't!" Sarah cried, but it was too late. He had already disappeared into the darkness, his silhouette swallowed by the trees.
Minutes passed, then hours, and still there was no sign of Alex. Panic began to set in. "Where the hell is he?" Jake said, his voice rising with fear. They called out his name, but the forest swallowed their words, absorbing them into its depths. A shadow moved among the trees, too large to be a deer, too quick to be a person. The group froze, their eyes wide with terror. A low growl rumbled through the forest, sending a chill down their spines. "Did you see that?" Mike whispered. Before anyone could answer, they heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. But these weren't human footsteps. They were heavier, deliberate, like something massive moving through the underbrush. And then a whisper, barely audible, seemed to come from all around them. Leave. Leave now. The voice was ancient, deep, and filled with malice. It was the forest speaking to them, and they understood. They needed to leave. But the forest had other plans. They turned to leave, but the path had changed. The trees had shifted, and the ground beneath their feet felt unfamiliar. They were lost.
The howls grew louder and closer. The air was thick with dread. The cursed wolf was near. Suddenly, a shape emerged from the darkness, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It was massive, a hulking creature with fur as black as the night itself. Its eyes locked with theirs, and in that moment they knew the legend was real. "Alex?" Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. But the figure did not respond. It simply stared, its gaze cold and unblinking. Then, with a sound like a low growl, it lunged. The group screamed, but their cries were swallowed by the forest. They ran, but the path twisted and turned, pulling them deeper into the woods. The cursed wolf was closing in. In the end, only Sarah was left standing. She turned, and for a brief moment she saw the truth. Alex was no longer Alex. He was one of them now, a part of the cursed pack, doomed to roam the forest for eternity. The howl echoed through the trees one last time, and the darkness swallowed her whole.
The title of the story: The Haunting of the Ancestor Stone. The sun had just begun its slow descent, casting an amber hue over the ancient trees of the forest. Sarah, Tom, Leah, Mike, and Aaron stood at the edge of the dense woods, taking in the beauty of the untamed land. The air was fresh, the quiet broken only by the rustling of leaves in the wind. It was the perfect place for a weekend camping trip, far away from the noise and stress of their everyday lives. But as they crossed the threshold into the forest, something about the place felt different. It was as though the land itself was holding its breath. They set up camp near a small clearing, their tents pitched around a large, jagged rock. The locals had warned them about the area, but the group had dismissed the stories as superstitions. They were just tales passed down through generations, they thought, nothing more than folklore. "Relax," Tom said, setting down his backpack. "We're just here to camp, have fun, and enjoy the wilderness. There's nothing to be afraid of." Leah, always the skeptic, laughed. "Yeah, but what's the deal with this stone? Looks like it's been here for centuries." Mike nodded in agreement, eyeing the large, flat stone that seemed to dominate the clearing. Its surface was worn and weathered by time, with strange carvings etched into the stone, symbols that seemed ancient and mysterious.
They say it's the ancestor stone, Mike added, mimicking the locals' accent. Some old legend about it being a resting place for spirits. Ghost stories, I bet. The group shared a nervous laugh, but as the shadows lengthened and the daylight began to fade, a strange stillness settled over the forest. The breeze that had been playful earlier seemed to disappear, leaving behind an unnerving silence. That night, around the campfire, they told stories, roasted marshmallows, and laughed. But as the fire flickered and popped, something in the woods seemed to watch them. The air grew thick, the warmth from the fire seemed to shrink, and the forest around them felt increasingly alive.
Then it started. At first it was subtle, almost imperceptible. Faint whispers that seemed to rise from the wind. Sarah, sitting closest to the stone, looked around, convinced she had heard someone call her name. "Did you hear that?" she asked, glancing nervously at the others. "Hear what?" Leah responded, her voice thick with mockery. "You're just spooked. It's just the wind." But Sarah wasn't so sure. She had heard her name. It was soft, barely a whisper, but it felt like it was coming from the stone itself. She tried to shake it off, but the hairs on her neck stood up. It was as if something ancient and powerful was beckoning them closer. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. At one point, Sarah thought she heard Aaron's voice, but when she turned to him, he was talking to Mike. "Guys, we're hearing things," Tom said, but his voice wavered slightly, betraying a hint of unease. "Let's just go to bed and forget about it." But sleep didn't come easy that night. The quiet forest outside their tents seemed to stretch endlessly, pressing in on them. Sarah lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her tent, listening to the strange noises that surrounded them. The whispers had followed her into the tent. She could hear them now, clearer, more distinct. They were no longer just murmurs in the wind. They were voices calling her name in a language she didn't understand. Her pulse quickened. She tried to push the terror out of her mind, but the whispers grew louder and louder until it felt as though they were inside her head. The next morning, Sarah was pale, her eyes wide and bloodshot from lack of sleep. She hadn't told anyone about the voices she had heard during the night, but they all noticed the change in her. "I keep hearing them," she whispered, her voice shaky. "They're getting louder, and I swear they're coming from the stone." Mike frowned. "It's probably just your imagination, Sarah. We're in the middle of nowhere. No one else is out here." But Sarah wasn't convinced. She couldn't shake the feeling that the stone was calling to her, pulling her closer. She didn't want to go near it, but it felt like the more she resisted, the stronger the pull became. That night,
As they sat around the campfire, Sarah fell into a deep, restless sleep. When she awoke, it was to the sound of whispers again, but this time they were clearer. The whispers weren't just calling her name anymore. They were speaking to her, telling her things she couldn't comprehend. The following day, the group grew restless, their sense of unease growing stronger. They were ready to leave the forest, but every time they tried to pack up, something would go wrong. Their tents had been uprooted, their bags disappeared and then reappeared in strange places. The forest itself seemed to be holding them hostage, as if it didn't want them to leave. As dusk fell, Sarah stood by the ancestor stone, drawn to it, as though some invisible force was compelling her. The whispers grew louder. The others tried to pull her away, but she stood frozen, staring at the stone. Her mouth moved, but no words came out. She was caught in a trance. Her eyes glazed over.
"Sarah, no!" Leah shouted, her voice filled with panic. She grabbed Sarah's arm, trying to pull her away from the stone. But Sarah wasn't moving. It was as if the stone had a grip on her, and she couldn't escape. Suddenly, the air turned cold. A gust of wind blew through the trees, and the whispers grew to a deafening roar. The ground beneath them trembled, and the sky darkened. Then, the twist. Sarah, her eyes wide and filled with terror, snapped back to reality. The whispers had stopped. The forest was quiet again. But the damage had been done. The others stood frozen in place, watching as Sarah slowly stepped back from the stone. I saw them," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "The spirits. They showed me what they want. They want us. They want our souls." In a panic, the group tried to leave, but it was too late. The forest had become a maze. No matter which direction they took, they kept coming back to the stone. The trees seemed to move, twisting and warping, blocking their escape. The whispers returned, but this time they weren't calling Sarah's name. They were calling all of them. The group was trapped. As the night wore on, one by one they began to fade. Their bodies grew weak, their energy drained. The stone had claimed them, just as it had claimed so many before. By the time the sun rose, there was no trace of the 5 travelers, just an empty camp and a stone standing silently in the heart of the forest. And the whispers, they still echoed, waiting for the next group of unwitting souls to hear their call.